Ayun, okay. Hello everyone, I'm George Mendoza, and this is the fifth episode of the Philippine Ruby Group podcast. Today we're going to discuss refactoring Ruby with monads, which was a presentation done by Tom Stewart last year at the Barcelona Ruby conference. I'm still waiting for other people to attend this hangout. I'm assuming that they can still join even though we're already live. But anyway, um, what am I? While waiting for them, I can I can do a brief overview of the presentation. So I'll include the link to the presentation in the show notes. Uh, in the presentation, Tom Stewart discusses what monads are. He uses three examples to demonstrate the type of what a monad is, uh, and when can a class be considered a monad. So it turns out from my understanding, is that a monad is very similar to your, um, I guess the closest in my experience is jQuery plugins, wherein you have a class that wraps an object that wraps another object, and then has has a method that returns instance of those objects. Mm-hmm. It's a very That's not quite a good explanation. Uh, but anyway, like I said, if you've programmed in JavaScript and you're familiar with jQuery, then the appearance of monads can be is something that you might be familiar with. So apparently, the biggest thing about a monad is that it has an and then method. That and then method returns an instance of that same class. Uh, and with that method, you can string several calls on the same on that particular, or you can chain calls to that particular to that part to a from a starting value. I guess it's best if I. Okay. While we're still waiting for other people to attend this, to join this podcast, what I'm going to do now is demonstrate the first example that Tom Stewart showed in his presentation. So for me, this is a more of a way to also understand the code that he demonstrated. So in this first example, Tom Stewart showed create uh, how to implement uh, Rails try without doing the monkey patching that uh, Rails does for that particular method. So he approached it in a more object-oriented manner. So let me, I guess we can already start. If someone just just if you're watching this, if someone joins in later, I may cut the screencast uh, to go from screencast to discussion mode, but I think I'll go right ahead. So let me share my screen first. if you've seen the previous episode of this podcast, you know that I have a problem with my. I'm not sure if it's on my OS or if it's my the Chrome in my OS. But unfortunately, if I can't share a separate window through Google Hangout. So you'll notice that I'll be switching screens every time I run a test. Okay. Uh, so this is the this is the first example that he did in the presentation. We have different classes, or in this case, those classes are implemented by structs for project, person, address, country, and city. And what we want to do is get the weather for a particular project by calling uh, getting the weather from the project down to the capital, down the weather. For this code, I created a spec for that weather for method. So what it should do is just get the happening to my mouse. Let me unplug my keyboard is acting a bit. It's not, the mouse is not working. Weird. Anyway, what we want to do is to get the weather for a particular project. So it should return the weather for a certain project's city, right? So in this case, this should return sunny. So we're expecting that the weather for this project should equal sunny, which is this value here. And now, here's the lousy part. If I run this test, and it pass. No question so far. But what happens? So the problem right now is what if we have a okay, no. What if we have a nil value? Like in this example. Let's write a test for this. Where see my notes here. Where this instance where the country is nil, or where there is no country. We're expecting to the weather for that particular bad project to become nil. There. Oh, okay. Someone joined in, but I can't see them. That's weird. Let's pause for a break. Let's pause for a moment. Let me check that someone's logged in. Oh, wait. No. No, sorry. Someone just messaged me on Facebook. Never mind. Let's go back to the screen share. Okay. Where so now our problem is where problem right now is my thing that's weird with my editor. Try closing Sublime first. Let's hope that I didn't have this problem before. Let's try this again. Let's hope it's working better. Oh, it seems to be. Where there. Okay. So what we're hoping to happen is that if one of the values in between the chain is nil, then weather 4 should return also nil. But if we do this right now, we get an error saying that we're trying to get a capital from nil. Now in Rails, the typical solution here is to use try. And in the presentation, Tom shows how to use try in that method. But he says that try is a bit of something of a code smell. It's not something. It's something we acknowledge to be not nice, but just convenient. And he says, what if we take a more object-oriented approach to solving this issue? So he said that the object-oriented approach here is to use a decorator. So a decorator wraps around your object, and you can use that decorator uh, to add additional functionality to that object that it's wrapping. In the okay, in the example, what he did was create a okay. So before we go there, I should mention one approach that he did is to check each object if it's nil. So, but as you can see, this approach is very horrible looking. He calls it pyramid of doom. One other term I heard for this kind of code is I can't remember if it's like a flock of keys. Anyway, you can flatten it like this, that weather 4, but it still has that same redundant code. For now, let's copy this code and our current, just to check if the spec will pass. Okay, I'm hoping that this passes. Okay, and we run that code. That's odd. What happened there? Main spec line 17. Ah, okay. Something. I forgot to add, this was the code earlier, I forgot to add the it block. Okay, let's run that again. There, now it's passing. So this time, let's try, instead of that, instead of this redundant code, let's try wrapping the this instances, project, creator, etc. in a decorator to handle situations where this project may be nil. So in this case, he created an optional class. That's a value. You pass on it a value, and if this struct will then, if you call value on this optional on an instance of this optional class, then it will return the value that you passed it. So like in this example here, if you passed it hello, then you can expect this value to return hello. And if you passed it nil, then you can expect this value to return nil. Now, this optional class, what we want to do is add a method that does the same thing as try, but it's not monkey patch to the object class. So this try can take any arguments and receive a block. And basically what it does is if the value of optional is nil, then it returns nil. Otherwise, we call those arguments and block from the value. Paste this in here. So now we'll need to change, we'll need to make the optional class inherit from the struct and add a try method to it. With that try in place, we can now do now this part here. Let's compare this with the current code. Our current code explicitly checks each value if it's nil before moving to each line. We're going to replace it with this code, so this wraps, what happens here is that our object gets wrapped in an optional decorator. This optional decorate project now can now call try, and then when this tries to call creator, then it should either return, what should it return? We're expecting it to return either nil or the value, or the value of that method. So here it can return nil, or the value of that method, and then we're going to wrap it in optional again. Same thing here, and so on until we reach the end. This is capital, and once we get the weather, which is wrapped in an optional object, we're going to get its value, and now we have the final value of that weather. So I can delete this old code and run this test. and it passes. Whoop-de-doo. Okay. Now, let's move on to the next part. The thing he says about try, though, is that with its particular call here, is that it seems it's limited, in that you can't. The only thing that you can do with it is a method, pass the name of a method to that optional object. So this in turn assumes that that method exists in the value. What would So for the sake of discussion, what Tom suggested is, what if we instead of having try receive a name of a method, what if we pass a block to it so that try can do anything as long as it has as long as that anything can return nil or can return a value. This is what he did. Let's copy paste this to our code and try to compare it with the current one. This is the new therefore. In this case, what we're doing now, if I'm checking, okay. Before we do this, we need to change the definition of optional. Let's do that first. This is the new optional, and this is the old one on top. Notice that try before try received can receive multiple arguments and pass it to the value. But now, instead of having the value send those arguments to the value, we're going to do is just call block and do whatever it wants with the value. This is the old code. We're removing it now. And it's called in the weather for method. It's like this. If you compare it with the top older code, which passed the method names, in here, what happens is that we pass the original value to this optional object, and that optional object takes that value and tries to get its creator. And whatever the result of that wrapper is gets wrapped in another optional record. And this is repeated until we reach the end where we get the value of the last optional record. So this is a bit longer than the previous one, but it's more flexible. You can now you can now do more things with this block. Also, as we'll see later, this is closer to our definition of monad. Okay. Sorry. Anyway, let's delete the old code and try it out. Okay. We have an error here that I didn't quite expect. Wrong number of arguments, 140. And this is, we're getting this in our IC. Happened there. Okay. Fix that issue and run this test again. Okay, now this is the error that I was expecting. If you can see that we have two examples, uh, the one for a good project and the one for a bad project, but now we're having one error. And this failure is coming from the bad project example. For some reason, we're getting, and we're trying to call try for a nil value. So at some point, our nil value isn't getting wrapped and in an optional class. So what's happening here? There. Okay. So let's compare it with the, so this was the error that we got. What is happening is that this is the solution. This code I just copied from the presentation. So it's just here so that we can compare the old and the new. Anyway, what's happening is that for our spec, where address has a nil, address has a nil country, I think. What's happening is that, okay, this original optional try, if the value is nil, returns nil. So in this case, this part here, this entire call, one of this is returning nil. And as a result, the next line is trying to call try on that nil value. The solution is to wrap that nil in an optional class so that it gets handled correctly. You might be thinking, and I'm also thinking, what happens with the other thing here? In here, since we're calling a block on the value, we don't have a control on the type of value that it returns. Oh, so we have to explicitly wrap that value, this try. Actually, we don't. No. In this case, what's happening is that we're wrapping the call, the result of a call in a block, in an optional object, and as a result, if the block executes or calls, then the optional record returns the optional argument. But if it's nil, then it should return this optional object. Before I continue, I think Richie is online. Hello, Richie. Are you there? I can't. I think you unmuted your mic, but I can't hear you. Hello? No sound. Or is it my... Let me check my audio just to make sure. Ah, yeah. Okay. Richie says it's something on his end. Um, I'll just continue with the screencast thingy that I'm doing. Is that okay? Okay, I'll just continue for now. At least we try to complete this screencast thingy. Okay, going back. So to recap, the problem with the previous code is that if the value is nil, it returns nil. If the value that if the value is nil, then try will return a nil. So in this case, one of these statements is called returning a nil. So we want to wrap that in an optional object. On the other hand, the block here doesn't have to wrap the result in an optional argument because its execution already does that. I do wonder what happens if we do wrap this in an optional argument and remove the optional here. But for now, let's follow what the code does. So have that code, we remove this, and now we run again our spec. And we fix this error undefined method try for nil. So far so good. The only problem is the problem with this code, as Tom mentioned in the presentation, is that it has what is probably the ultimate code smell, which is that no one wants to write this kind of long code. So his solution is to, okay, well, one thing we can do is to, instead of assigning each result of the end then, wait, we're going a bit ahead. So in the previous code, our method was try. But as Tom said, try is not the best term for this method anymore because, well, why isn't it not? Basically because we're not trying, unlike before, we're not trying to call a method from the value. So he suggested we change this to and then. So let's just do that right now. Wait, I can't do. Let's do that right now. And name is to and then. Just check if the S is passing. It is. Okay. And we can shorten this further by chaining the and then calls. So this is the current code and this is the new one. Okay. The code is similar except that this time we're just chaining and then calls from each and then result. You can sure that this will work because the blocks return optional, and if for some reason the and then returns, if the value passed to the optional is nil, then we'll get an optional object with the value nil. So let me check again if this passes. and it does. So far, so good. So this is, as it is, this is quite shorter than the previous code, but we can make it more convenient to write this weather for with by using method missing. So we can add some syntactic sugar to so that we don't have to write this long code. There, this part. Let's copy this first and I'll try to explain what it does. So what this does, method missing, is that if there's any call to optional that isn't implemented by optional, it gets called here. And what happens here is that if we try to call a missing method on optional, like for example in this instance where we're trying to call creator, address, country on optional, tama ba yun? On, I think so. Oh wait, not yet. We're not there yet. Um, what we want to happen is that if we call a method on optional and it doesn't exist, then we're going to call and then do this block, which if you notice the the call here is a generic representation of the call here. You have an and then, you have a block, like in here, you have an instant initialization of optional with the value calling that particular method. So this is the generic implementation or general implementation of these calls here. Once we add this, then we can already chain the methods. We can call the methods directly from the optional object. So this final line here. Let's compare them first. What happens now is that instead of initializing or constructing the optional objects in the block, we're calling methods directly from optional that optional doesn't implement. And as a result, those missing methods get passed here to our method missing method. So if we remove old implementation, trying to call and now use our method missing implementation, let's pass. Yay. So this is going back. Okay. So going back to that presentation, what we just did is refactor the code with a monad, uh, with a class that implements a monad data type. If I recall correctly, a monad, the important thing about a monad is that it has an and then. That's an and then method. And it's not guaranteed that that and then will return an optional, another monad. Let me check. Hmm. Okay, I can't. Unfortunately, I can't find the presentation. But anyway, the biggest thing about the monad is this and then, and that this and then method gets used to chain. You get a class, the monad, wrapping in some value, and then using and then to string or to chain calls on that particular value through blocks. This part here. I recommend that you check original the original presentation because he explains it better than I do, and that he has additional examples of monads uh, for for explain the concept. So that's about it. Um, so what I'll do, hopefully, if I have time, is update the update the notes for this podcast and upload it to the Philippine Ruby Group website. That's still something I have to do. Uh, I'm also thinking that next week, I'm thinking of opening up the topic to any topic. Uh, the idea is that anytime we do this podcast, anyone who attends can talk about anything that they find interesting on Ruby or programming, software development. So it's like, remember in our previous podcast we did picks. So in this case, we're going to do the picks the entire the entire podcast. I'm hoping that uh, this will make it more interest. This will encourage more people to attend regularly because there's no limit to what can be discussed. Uh, let's see how that works. Um, I just want to say thank you very much for Richie for trying to attend. Unfortunately, he has a problem with his internet connection on his end, or his audio connection on his end. Uh, Hopefully, we can discuss some Ruby-related stuff next week. Uh, I think we can now sign off. Thank you very much. Hope to see you all again next week. Take care of yourselves. Bye bye.